gotten a lot more focus and attention in the media. And for that reason, we have invited the folks who we have here on the stage with us to help facilitate this conversation and discussion about our rights, our individual rights and freedoms. So, with no further ado, I'm going to start from my right. I was going to try to roll my R, but I can't do it, brother. Also known as the mayor of the mission. Okay, Roberto Hernandez. Can everybody give a hand, please? Has been a longtime civil rights activist here in San Francisco. Took the SFPD and the city to task in the early 80s, I believe it was. Am I right? Next to him is a younger lady, Denise Gastelum, who is also a civil rights attorney and practices out of the Los Angeles area and has been doing this for quite some while and to a lot of good effect. Denise Gastelum. The man in the middle probably doesn't need much introduction, as you've probably seen him on TV at the very least, and maybe in the news, newspapers. John Burris is a civil rights icon in the Bay Area. He is also my business partner, and we practice law together. And he's been teaching me a couple things. John Burris. Last but surely not least, it helps to have a perspective from law enforcement. Somebody who can give us a little bit of the inside scoop about this discussion that we're going to have. And that would be none other than Yolanda Williams, who has been with the San Francisco Police Department for how many years now? 32. I was going to say 30. 32 years. So welcome, Captain Williams. Before we go any further, I believe we do have a few special guests in the house. I want to say thank you to Manny's for hosting. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to speak with you all, and to all of you who are viewing online. Of course, I would be remiss without mentioning Deborah Walker, who is also here, and hopefully will also be one of our new police commissioners. All right. With that, I got some questions. And hopefully we got some answers. I'm going to go first with Mr. Burris here. Knowing our individual rights, why is that important at all? Is it important? Can you tell us why?
Well, obviously it's very, very important. Knowing what your rights are can, in fact, save your life, and it also can cause the police to back off from you. On the other hand, I always caution people, beware how you exercise those rights when you're on the streets, because you can be dead right because of the way an officer responds. But there are all kinds of rights based upon the Fourth Amendment, 14th Amendment, that really go to what the police can or cannot do, supposedly. I will tell you supposedly, because they obviously have restrictions by law. But we know if we wouldn't have this, I wouldn't be in this business if they followed the rules. Mm-hmm. We wouldn't have as many people arrested falsely and/or people who have been shot and killed wrongfully if the police followed the rules that they have. But certainly you have rights. Walking down the street, and you haven't done anything, can the police stop you? They really don't have a right to stop you. But if they have reason to believe that a crime has taken place and you may have been involved in it, they can in fact stop you. And they can ask you questions from it. You never have to answer any questions. You have to decide whether it's in your best interest to do that or not at the time, but you're not required to. But the areas that you have to be concerned about, not only as a pedestrian walking down the street, and we've done a lot of work around racial profiling, because that's a major issue for me. You also have cars being stopped in your car, whether or not there's a basis to stop you or not. There has to be probable cause or suspicion. Then the issue becomes the search of the car.
Why is this important for these folks to know?
It's important for everyone to know what their rights are and know when you can exercise those rights and the protections that you have related to them. As I said, that think about anything that infringes upon your personal freedom, whether walking down the street or in your car or in your house. There are rules that protect you against the police in the event that they do certain things. And one of those is probable cause or reasonable suspicion. There are all kinds of rules that relate to that. And so fundamentally you ought to know that you do have these rights, whether you're in your car, walking down the street, or in your house, you have certain rights. And we all know about Miranda warnings. That is to say, if they believe that you've committed a crime and they've focused in on you and they're taking you into custody, or your rights or your freedom is restricted, you're entitled to your Miranda warnings before they, in fact, can ask questions of you.
All right.
You can waive all that, but you do have the right. You do have those rights.
All right. Well, thanks for that. Mr. Hernandez, can I call you Mr. Hernandez? No, sir. No, we're family here. Okay, we're closer than that.
Yo te llamo Roberto.
I got it. Okay, let me try. Roberto. Is that pretty good? Oh, look at that. Roberto. You've been doing this for a long time, at least standing up for your individual rights specifically. What was it like in the 1980s doing this as an individual going against the establishment? What was it like for you?
It was horrifying. You know, I got arrested 113 times for exercising my rights. And when you ask that question, what can everybody in this room do? You know, you all have a responsibility. If you see an officer doing something that's not correct, you have the responsibility to get their badge number. And now we got phones, so you can pull out your phone and you can record it, you know, and be a witness. And so for us, you know, in the late 70s into the 80s, we were low riding down Mission Street like we still do. And it got to the point where it was forbidden to low ride on Mission Street. And literally they turned Mission Street into martial law, where nobody could drive down Mission Street.
For those folks who may not be familiar with what low riding is, can you explain that to our viewers at home? I mean, I know.
Google it.
Fair.
Low riding. I want to hear it.
Low ride is it's an art form, and we put a lot of time, money, and love into creating a vehicle by painting it. You will never see two lowriders painted the same. We have upholstery that's custom made. We have sound systems that are custom made.
Loud.
And then and yeah, very loud. And then we have hydraulics that make the lowrider dance.
So we're talking about the 6.4s, the Impalas and all that, right?
The rag top.
The rag tops, okay. Not the hard top.
Yeah. So we were, you know, just cruising, and there was a movie that came out, Boulevard Nights, and everybody wanted to become a lowrider after that. You know, it came out of L.A., in fact, and so it was literally a parade every Friday and Saturday night, and the police just didn't, you know, they just didn't know how to manage it or, you know, handle it, and so they brought out the tactical squad every Friday night, and literally in riot gear and with their batons, and literally would form a line from one side of the street to the other side of the street, and then start clearing the street, and then literally shut down the street. And a lot of us, you know, they would break our tail lights. I mean, they would just do, so many illegal things. So what we did was we started documenting everything. We got lawyers to come out there and represent us. We got photographers to come out and photograph. We got video crews to come and film. And so we started documenting everything, and eventually we went and met with the mayor at that time, Dianne Feinstein. We met with the members of the Board of Supervisors. We met with the police commissioners, the police chief. I mean, we met with everybody in the city. Everybody acknowledged that there was a problem, but yet nobody wanted to do anything to change and fix the problem.
I want to add one point that's very important that you should all know. You do have a right to videotape your camera if you see something taking place. The important part you got to remember, you cannot get within 10 feet of it, because then you will be perceived to be interfering. So you have a right to do it, but you got to stay a safe distance away, and you can't interfere by physically touching officers or grabbing them for whatever reason, because it's unsafe. But you should know that. You can film, but you got to be within 10 feet from them in order for it.
Thank you for that. You touched on something, Roberto, about everybody noticing that there was a problem, but folks not necessarily having either the backbone or the political will to do something about it, right? One of the problems that certainly I think that all of us can acknowledge, and maybe Captain Williams, you could speak specifically to this, is racism that may exist in policing, that may be almost inherent, seemingly. Now, you, a 30-year veteran of SFPD, these are accusations that are oftentimes lodged and launched from, folks that's like us who don't wear the blue or the badge. Is it true? Is there racism that you've seen, that you've observed?
Well, I've been a police officer, as stated, for 32 years, and it wasn't until 2012 that I experienced a sign of racism within the department that I was working in. When I joined, I thought we were all one big blue family and that they were going to have my back when my family didn't have my back. However, I learned in 2015 when a newspaper story hit the San Francisco press. And it was at that point I recognized that no matter how much blue I wore, I was still black. And as a black female, that was considered the most despicable of all. And to then consider myself qualified to take their promotional exams were insulting to them. So I have learned that racism is ingrained in the institution of policing. And also I have learned that if you survive for 30 years or more in an institution that is racist historically and by nature and resistant to reform, you're going to learn to accept that and deal with that. So it's what I call cumulative trauma. And when you've experienced it so much, you have the pressure, the peer pressure from the other officers, which in turn makes you focus what you have experienced onto other people. So is there racism within the police department? Definitely. And if you don't believe it, go by a station or go try and communicate with someone when they don't want to be bothered and they're in the blue uniform. It's an unfortunate thing, but it's true. And it's unfortunate that we don't have officers out here serving the community that looks like the people that are seated here today.
No doubt about it. I'd be remiss if I did not mention the election that happened last night. As most of us in this room know, the district attorney was recalled. He had definitely ran a progressive campaign and was doing just that as an acting DA, but he's gone now. I'd like to put to the panel, what do you think a DA can do about the issue of police brutality? Do they serve any function in helping us combat this issue? And that's to everybody. If anybody wants to say something.
Yeah, they do. I mean, the fact is that here in the Mission District, how many Latino men have been killed by the police? And how many of those cases were actually investigated by the district attorney's office, and how many police officers were actually held accountable for murder? None. Not one.
Yeah.
I
Mario
think
Woods.
it's even more raw than that, because that's the death cases. Most of the cases aren't death. The everyday cases where the DA is charging people.
Use your mic a little bit.
They get to charge, and that's the real damage that is done in the charging. And whether it's petty theft, burglary, or whatever, where there's real discretion. And when you look at the discretion that the DAs have, you will find generally that if a white's involved, it's one thing. If black or Mexicans involved, it's something else. And that's where the real initial discrimination or racial bias comes in at the charging level. And that follows all the way through the judicial system, all the way through. And one of the things that the point that's been made here is about the internal component of racism within a department. Well, think about this. how do you deal with that when you have a department that may have 10%, 15%, 25% African Americans or Hispanics in it? It might be majority, and the conduct still occurs. So it has nothing to do with the ethnic component of the persons involved. It's what the police department is. It's the conditions that have developed. I refer to it as, we talk about implicit racism, but actually it's more racism than implicit.
You brought up a great point, Mr. Burris, and I want to bring Denise in to this because I know that you've worked on some of these cases down in Los Angeles, specifically in regards to the sheriff's department, and there's definitely been some accusations of racism in the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. But I want to focus the question a little bit more on things have changed. And Mr. Burris, you also brought up a good point of, look, now people are video recording a lot of these incidents and interactions with police. And there's different technology, there's different times, right? So versus where we were in 2020 to versus where we are now after this a large civil rights, I guess, movement has happened because of the George Floyd killing in Minnesota and others. Where are we at now versus 2020? How have things changed, Denise?
Thank you, DeWitt. And it's interesting that it's 2022, and all we are focusing on what's happened since May 25th, 2020 to right now, right? It's literally a little bit over 2 years. And it was George Floyd's murder that caused this great awakening, this great reckoning that we have seen. But despite the fact that there was millions of people all throughout the United States protesting, and mind you, in Los Angeles, I'm one of the attorneys representing 4,000 plaintiffs as a result of the abuse that they received by the LAPD from the George Floyd protests. Despite the fact there was millions of people, nationally speaking, there were 17 pieces of legislation that were up for consideration all throughout the United States, right? Some of those, obviously, we're aware of are the House bills, the End Qualified Immunity.
Mm-hmm.
That one died. That didn't even get a House pass. And we also had the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which passed in the House by nearly a party line vote. And what I mean by that, 0 Republicans voted for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And I'm not sure everybody's aware of that, but that is so important. It's a slap in the face, right? And then, frankly, that went over to the Senate and it died. It died in the Senate last year, despite all of Booker's work and all of Bass's work. And go ahead.
I was going to say, the George Floyd Racial Justice Act, there were a number of provisions for it, and all of them passed to the House. But when it got to the Senate, the only one that could not pass, that broke the deal, was qualified immunity, which was the most important aspect of it all.
Right.
And so other states have tried. I know New Mexico, Colorado, even the city of New York have done away with qualified immunity. And that's a battle that we're having constantly, even in California state legislature. So there's that kind of activity that's taking place.
Right, and Scott basically told us to pound sand if qualified immunity was part of the bill, and that's why it died in the Senate. So that's just nationally speaking. Well, I guess we also have to talk about the executive order that just came down May 25th, 2022, literally last month, right? 2-year anniversary of George Floyd's murder. Frankly, I didn't even want to talk about that executive order because I feel like it really just doesn't really do much. All it does, it basically, for federal officials, which mind you, there's 100,000 federal officials in the United States that this executive order imposes some kind of rules upon. There are 18,000 state agencies and local agencies of police departments and sheriff's departments all across the United States. For example, the LA Sheriff is one of those 18,000. They have 20,000 employees. All right. So this executive order only applies to federal officials. It It's demanded a revision to the use of force, no chokeholds. It's addressed the no knock announce rule. It has this voluntary, not mandatory, voluntary database that they are to report bad officers to. And what else does it have? A bunch of other silly things that really, frankly, don't actually do anything for brown and black people, communities of color, immigrant communities. In California, I will be remiss if obviously I didn't mention the National Police Accountability Project. Both John and I are on that board, and we were in the trenches to ensure that SB 2 got passed, and that's the Senator Bradford push for that bill. And as much as ultimately there was a lot of concessions, and I will agree that it was completely watered down, we got something passed.
And could you tell us what SB, the bill did? Because for folks who are not familiar with it.
Yeah, so it's the Senate Bill 2, and it was propositioned by Senator Bradford and the then, I think she actually still is, President Pro Tem Atkins. And essentially what SB 2 does in California is that there's decertification of bad police, and I hate using the term bad police because it sounds so kind of simplistic, but what that basically means is that there's a process now in place to decertify officers who've been convicted of certain crimes that speak of lying, sexual misconduct, or use of excessive force, or if they've been terminated. But even that process is extremely watered down, especially once you actually get to know the bill.
I want us to talk about that a little bit more.
Okay.
But before we get to that, I do want to talk about some of the other victories that we have had. You know, I think, Assemblymember Shirley Weber was very courageous in getting some legislation passed here in California for transparency, right? Greater transparency for us, lawyers who are out here, fighting for folks in individual civil rights. Has that really helped, Mr. Burris?
Well, certainly it has helped. I mean, because we got to remember, I did the Rodney King case 30 years or so ago, and all we had was that particular camera. We had nothing that followed up on it. But in the last 5 years in the state of California, through Shirley Weber and others who have gone before the legislature, they've gotten some real legislation passed that is extraordinarily important, and certainly as it goes to transparency. You all know about video cameras, but now you have to turn those video cameras over that the police have, body cameras and cell phones, have to be turned over in a certain period of times. The one that's recently noted is that police officers' background. If you've been caught in lying, you've been sexually involved cases, or serious violence cases, all that can be turned over. I will tell you, that could not happen years ago. You could not get these backgrounds with a whole lot of different kind of activities that's taken place. So we've had those kinds of things. And more recently, one of the cases I'm involved in California, up here north, is the Quinto case, and that's an asphyxiation case. Mm-hmm. Well, the governor just signed a bill that essentially says you can't involve in this, quote, George Floyd type of hold. That is, that you get on the back of the neck and press down on it, and therefore asphyxiating the person, like in George Floyd. We have a case like that, as you know, that we're working on, and other kinds of cases that are similar in terms of the type of hold. Everyone should know you shouldn't be doing a chokehold in the first place. I mean, they did that in L.A. back when Johnny Conker and them was practicing law. Mm-hmm. They got the city of L.A. to outlaw chokehold. Yep. But that has not carried forward through most of the states. But now the governor signed something that says cities cannot do that. Now, this is just California, and a lot of activity has taken place. It's not perfect, because I tell you this, I did a thing the other day. George Floyd, obviously everybody heard, they haven't stopped shooting people since George Floyd.
No.
No,
right. Unfortunately.
Now, you may have some other activities that I've been involved in. I think we've done a lot more work around racial profiling, as you know, in Oakland Riders case and some of the cases we did in San Francisco. To me, those kinds of things are most important. It really burned my, you know what, when I see people being stopped and searched for no apparent reason, and then they take a chance to get their careers ruined because you get stopped and they charge you with a 148 or 240, resisting arrest and assault on a police officer, and it's a cop-generated event. Now, this is where the DA comes in. The DA doesn't have to charge those cases. The police may, in fact, be involved in it, and if the DA looks at it, the DA should not charge them. That has had a tremendous positive impact. I've talked to the DAs both in Alameda County and in San Francisco about those when Kamala was there, and we had a reduction in those type of charges. Those are the kind of things that ruin people's lives. And so I've been very fortunate to get some movement around that.
And there's
Go
one
ahead, Denise.
additional law as well, and I think a lot of this is more so like the bigger picture, as we like to say. I think it's AB 89, and what that requires is it increases the minimum age of 18 to the age of 21 for aspiring police officers. And it's created these, in community colleges, this police degree whereby aspiring police officers can get a degree. It's kind of like an academy. And they're required to take psychology classes, ethnic study classes, and communication classes. And we're in a safe space, right? So my first 3 years of practice, I used to defend the LA Sheriff's Department under. Yeah, no, as I always say, y'all get my email, send your hate mail, throw some eggs, it's fine. It's made
I'm
me
just joking. I don't hate the
Yeah.
police.
I was a DA once too, so.
Yeah.
I've worked in the DA's office
And I
as well.
worked for Johnny Cochran before that, so it's all right. The point is, I remember being a baby lawyer and like sitting down with commanders, and there I am, this little Latina, 26-year-old, telling these commanders, hey guys, like, I think it's probably a good idea to not hire 18-year-olds and give them guns and engage in this like high decision making before they're killing people out on the streets. Or have them be a little bit, you get more worldly, if you will. I'm not saying that you have a PhD doesn't make you a piece of shit. What I'm saying is surely being more well-rounded and getting some education under your belt, particularly ethnic studies, communications, psychology, etc., doesn't hurt, especially if they have that big of responsibility being out on the street patrolling our communities.
It most certainly can be helpful. Captain, you want to add something to that?
Yes, I was just going to say, it's interesting that you say 21 in order to be a police officer. But I think it should be 25. It's 25 in San Francisco to be a bus driver. So I think if we're giving you a gun, you should at least be 25, because we know that males' brains don't develop until then. The other thing that is going to be paramount, if we're really going to create reform and a safer environment for you all, because I think I'm going to go into consulting work, because I think I have a lot of fun tackling this. But we have to.
We need you.
We do.
We have to have a national database where all of the officers' police disciplinary records are generated into it. California can be the first state to start it as a pilot program. I have spoken about this to several assembly persons and one senator in particular, and nothing has happened. So I think that the power is right here in the room with the people. And I think that you need to demand that every California law enforcement agency start to turn over those records to a database that would be handled in the state of California, up there in Sacramento, and that we have people like myself who are reformists that go out to these district stations and see what's really going on throughout California.
And I love that, and I'm just going to mention this. During the SB2 hearings that we were participating in, police union after police union, police officer after police officer were calling and having their voice heard. I'd say out of like 100 calls, 80 of them were police officers, captains, etc. 20 of them were just civilians. And I love what you just said right now. Like, we need to also take that power back.
A great segue, and I want to acknowledge all power to the people, power in the room, absolutely, 100%. Captain Williams and Denise, you touched on something I think is important about the attitude of law enforcement with all these changes that we're talking about trying to happen, right? You got, legislatures trying to propose things. You got civil rights lawyers out here fighting. You got folks like Roberto out here fighting. Is law enforcement willing to change? Do you get the idea that they're willing to change at all, Captain Williams? I mean, give us some hope, please.
It's Battleship Galactica. I have to be quite frank with you. Right now in the San Francisco Police Department, the Police Commission is meeting right now on an issue. They had an epiphany that although they brought a chief here that looks like me, and as the president of the Officers for Justice, I was the reason why the Department of Justice came here to interview and to all of a sudden investigate San Francisco Police Department. And that's how we got to the 270-plus DOJ reform
A
initiatives.
little help from the lawyers, I started.
And
that.
of course,
A little help from the lawyers, okay.
Little help from the lawyers and also from the
I had
people.
to be the whistleblower.
Yeah,
I hear you.
So, as a whistleblower, I have to share with you that there are too many resistors out there for change to occur. And in order for change to occur internally, all of the internal leaders have to change with a chief. You can't bring in a new chief and still have the same body parts and think that all of a sudden you're going to be restored and made new. So that
hear-
would be my
To
response.
follow up on this, and how difficult it is. I started this case in 2000. Many of you may have heard of it, called the Riders case. And that was a group of officers who were running ripshod over, very much like the Rampart people down in LA. And so I started this case in 2000. In 2003, we got the equivalent of a consent decree, with the idea that in 5 years or maybe 7 years at most, they would have complied with all the tasks that we had agreed upon. It was 52 tasks. Well, we just recently, after 20 years I've been involved in this case, finally got the DA, and I got the police department to get into compliance. And the reason why it was difficult is there was resistance all along the way. Constant resistance, we couldn't get them into compliance.
You're speaking about the receivership of the Oakland Police Department.
Receivership, but we had a independent monitor, and myself and another lawyer, we stayed involved. But the point is, there was resistance, because what we had asked them to do was something they could have done. This was not like new policing from Mars. This was the best police practices that we had studied and knew what was around the country that can be done. But even with all of that, the old guard who affected the young people, they would not do it. And it took all these years and constant court intervention for this to get to the point now where they could be on probation for 1 year.
Roberto, it kind of echoes back to a question that I asked you a little bit earlier, right? And we talked about some changes that have happened, right? And I understand back in the 80s, you know, the cops were very much opposed to the low riding. You know, I have fond memories of you guys being out by Red's Cafe out there. I used to come out there with you guys, man. You didn't know that. I was a little guy. How's the attitude changed now at all, if any?
Cops.
Yeah, from the cops. That's what I mean, the cops.
They were forced to, because what we did, we filed a federal lawsuit, you know, we put the city on trial. We sued the mayor, the board of supervisors, the police chief, anybody we touched, we sued them and named them in the suit. And that scared the shit out of them. And they kept trying to, you know, settle out of court before we even went to trial. We said no. They were throwing money at us. We said nope. And the trial started, and deposed the mayor, deposed the chief. I mean, and let me scare it scared that shit out of them. And we were having fun, you know, with that, you know, because the city attorney kept coming back and saying, and finally he said, hey, Roberto, write on pieces of paper, blank paper, write a number, right? And to us, it wasn't about money at all. It was about the right, because across the city, on the west side, the white kids were racing for pink slips. And they never were touched. But why? Because they were Irish, and who her daddies were? The police department,
Yeah.
right? You know?
We're talking about old Ocean Beach. Yeah.
Great Highway.
Yeah.
You know, and so for us, it was causing change. And the change that the suit forced the city, and not even the department, the city, that no longer could they use the academy and use the mission as a training ground. Because we got in the depositions and on trial, rookies saying that they were forced to act a certain way to be able to pass their probation,
Right on.
Yeah.
right, against brown people on Mission Street specifically. And we got marching orders. But let me just end by saying that I don't agree with all this reform shit. I don't. If you go back to how did the police department even start in this country? There was no police department. If you look at the native people of this land, the Ohlonies that we are, and I want to honor them, and we're on their land, they didn't have police.
Respect.
They took
Yeah.
they took care of each other. And the reason we started police in this country is because of the black slaves
Slave
that
patrols.
were running away, and they felt threatened, and they used that as a way to start a police department. And so if you look at the history of the police department, it was about racism from the very beginning. So don't think that today, you don't,
Yeah.
why is it the racism? Because from the very founding of the police department, it was about against black people, right? So what we need to do is we really need reform that's going to make sure that neighborhoods like the Mission, Hunters Point, Western Addition, people are involved in taking care of their neighbors, right? And we got to do it block by block. Because if right now, does everybody know their neighbor? People don't. You know
I know
what
mine. I know
what,
mine.
What I do, I'm the block captain of my block. Yeah. You move on my block, I go knock
I'm
on
gonna
your
know
door.
you.
When you move in, I bring you tamales, and let me tell you, some people are like, oh shit, what does he want, right? And I bring them tamales, and I welcome them, right? And some of the, I say it's not poison. I say, let me eat one right now in front of you, you know. But you know, it's going back to people knowing each other, you know. And don't matter if you're black or purple or white or brown, we living on the same block. You know, that's what we need to do is take all that police money and all that criminal justice money and put it back to hiring people to maybe be block captains so that the elder next door, I take care of them when they need to be taken care of.
I want you to, before I go to this decertification, which I want to talk, Denise, you talked about that a little bit earlier. Captain Williams, part of, I know a lot of police programs, even in the early 2000s, talked about gaining more foot patrols as being a way to kind of unite and connect more with the community. What do you think about that as the foot patrols? Is that a solution? Is that an answer to what Roberta was saying here?
Well, for me, it was an easy transition, and it was welcomed because I grew up in Potrero Hill. I lived in the Bayview, and I patrolled the Bayview by choice. In fact, I demanded that they remove me from Chinatown and bring me into the Bayview. Foot beats were wonderful because that's a way you get to know the people that you're supposed to serve. You learn to respect them. You learn to trust them. And I'll tell you something. I discovered that whenever somebody was giving me a problem, I didn't have to pull out a baton. I didn't have to pull out any mace. I didn't have to do any of that because someone in the community was going to intervene on my behalf. And the young people learned, instead of calling me Officer Williams, they called me Auntie. And even when I would be off of work, just walking around in the community, not even paying any attention to what they're doing, they're selling drugs, I don't even know what's going on. The guy threw his drugs down and put it in the sewer. And he said, oh, Auntie, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to disrespect you like that. I said, what are you talking about? And he told me what he did, and I said, good, it's Sunday, you needed to give that a rest. He said, well, can I go out there and get it? Can you let me go get him? I said, if you go over there and touch that, I'll call those blue, the blue. And of course, through the years, these are still young people that are out there now. Of course, they're adults and they got their kids. That's when I know it's time to retire. But they tell people the stories of how we met. So those relationships, building them one day at a time, are far more important than having your police officer driving around in a patrol car with gas prices the way they are and running all over the place. Get out and do the real work on the footbeats.
Denise, you talked a little bit earlier about decertification. I know that's one of the bills, and you said it was a little watered down, right? But decertification is the idea that we can kind of get rid of some of these problematic police officers instead of them getting fired or leaving one department and going to some other department without notice from the community, that they would be kind of decertified and not allowed to be a police officer. Is that right?
That's right. And
How is that watered down? How can that work? Can that help weed out some of these folks who've been problems for our communities?
absolutely. And I'm going to answer that, DeWitt, but I'm going to touch on Captain Williams. Beautiful. I love that story regarding that fella. And go back to what Roberto was talking about regarding the elephant in the room, and that's racism. Because I feel like ultimately it's black and brown folks, it's the color of our skin. I'm Mexican, from Sinaloa and Chihuahua, immigrant parents. And what's interesting is you talk about whether it's the training, whether it's the policies, but what's interesting is that when they're faced with an armed white man, they follow their training 95% of the goddamn time, right?
Hello.
Rittenhouse, they waved at the bastard while he was holding the assault rifle. And I think that that is just the perfect example of how this goes deeper than these policies and these trainings and reform and decertification. It's really about how these police agencies came about and how they were breeded out of racism.
Doesn't decertification, and you can answer this too, doesn't it give an opportunity to get rid of some of these folks?
It does, but if you actually understand the decertification process here in California, and mind you, before SB2, when we as California agreed to decertify or create this system to decertify our police officers, we were one of 4 states in the United States that did not have a process in place, and that's California. That should be shocking to everybody in this room. Ultimately, I mean, so POST is the Peace Officers Standards and Training, which is basically the body that controls the police officers and deputies here in California. Within POST, there's a division now that they've created, essentially like a unit, where they have power to investigate officers who've engaged in misconduct. And again, lying, sexual nature, or use of excessive force. This division, this unit that exists now within POST, has an advisory board that essentially kind of oversees them. They're kind of like a civilian oversight. That advisory board is comprised of 9 individuals who are appointed by the governor. Here's some water down. They could only make a recommendation as to whether an officer should be decertified. And these 9 individuals will, for the most part, be made up of 9 law enforcement individuals. Prior to the watering down, it was required, again, before the concessions were made, that 2 of those 9 be victims of police abuse, right? Either they themselves or they lost a loved one at the hands of police violence. And that's kind of what I mean. I mean, am I happy? Are there eyes on the store now? Sure, right? There's eyes on the store.
At least they're supposed to be.
Right. And, you know, there's this, what do we say? It's not that we hate the police, it's that we fear them, right? And we fear them because we don't trust them, because time after time, they've proven to us that they don't like black and brown people. And I hate to keep going back to it, but it's the heart of the matter. And so am I happy that there's a decertification process? And I didn't want to dumb it down, but that's honestly, folks, what our decertification process is in California. Again, I think of it as eyes on the store. I think it's a step forward. There's at least, there's going to be public hearings, by the way. This was passed last October. They gave them, 1 year to create this division and 1 year to create this advisory board. So hopefully by October, the process will begin. And there's going to be public hearings where we could all obviously attend, and then the records will be made public. So,
Mr. Burris, you had something you wanted to add to
I
this?
just want to say that, yeah, obviously all that's extraordinarily important. There's a lot of work that's being done, I should say, through the legislature, through various interest groups, trying to get things done. And there's pushback. And the major pushback, if we all know, you should all know, is police unions.
yeah.
Police unions are the most powerful entities against police reform in the country. And that's not just in California, it's all throughout the country. So you have to fight them as well. When you go before the legislature and make your pitch for how you want to improve, the person who's also on the other side of that room at the same time making their pitch is police unions. And they really are the biggest impediment to significant police reform that's going to somehow impact police standard, discipline, or whatever. That's their mantra. And so that's the part that I find to be most challenging. The more recent bill I looked the other day in a police shooting happened out here, and that is the AG now do a bill that says that the AG, if a person is killed, unarmed person is killed by the police, then the Attorney General has to conduct the investigation. That is something that's been fought for years. And I don't know if it's going to work, but the argument was the local police should not investigate itself, particularly in police shooting cases. Now, it's only limited to when there's unarmed person. But most cases, you could have weapons all the time. That doesn't mean you get to kill them.
Or the perception of a weapon.
Perception of a weapon, and we see that all the time. People the police claim that they're reaching for their waistband, and we know, it seems to make common sense to me, that a person who's being confronted with a police officer with a gun in front of him is not going to reach to his waistband and have nothing there. That doesn't make any sense.
Doesn't make sense.
But it is an explanation that the police justify all the time.
All the time.
And John, I actually represent the family of Joseph Tracy, which is the first shooting in California where the AG has come in to investigate. So I will let you know how that investigation goes. It's mandatory for them to investigate the shooting of an unarmed person in California now.
Roberto, Mr. Burris talked about something that I thought was important in the police kind of being an impediment, and I guess Captain Williams, you talked about this as well. Something that has come up in progressive circles for a long time is this police officers' Bill of Rights, right? And how we combat that. What do you think about the police officers' Bill of Rights versus our individual rights as persons, as regular persons out here? Shouldn't we get the benefit of the doubt in that?
Well, I want to start off by first of all acknowledging that in California, for example, the educators were the most powerful lobbyists in California. And if you look at who's been the most powerful lobbyists in California and then in the Senate and in Congress, it's the police.
Law enforcement, the police officers.
Law enforcement, probation department, sheriffs, prison guards. They've bonded together, and they've created this big powerhouse. And they give a lot of money to every candidate. They own people in Congress and in Senate and in the Assembly and in the Senate here in California. So when you look at that, that don't work, right? I mean, here in San Francisco, the police used to investigate themselves, and we organized, and we created the Office of Citizens Complaint, which was an independent office. I remember Dan Silva was the first one who came from the Mission District, who was the first director of that department and was investigating. I remember him getting threatened. You talking about the Office of Citizens Complaint, an independent, and the director of that department was being threatened, and his family? That tells you a lot, right? But anyway, that happened, that change happened. But fast forward, you're still getting people being killed by the police.
Sure.
In fact, didn't they just kill 2 brothers up in Potrero Hill?
Right on 16th and Mississippi.
It's being investigated
Yeah.
by the Attorney General right now, so it's going to be interesting to see what happens with that case. And unfortunately, one of the officers involved is a pretty close friend of mine, very level-headed, but it's a tragic situation all the way around. But it's going to be interesting to see what the outcome is going to be on this particular case.
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
we should have cautiousness around the Attorney General. I've dealt with them many, many years in trying to bring cases to them. Some of the cases I've had in San Francisco, I've taken to the AG's office, cases from other cities and towns. Not once have they decided to prosecute, not once. Now, will they do it now differently because they will have original jurisdiction? The point that they always have made so far is that it's really up to the local DA and whether or not they've abused their discretion before we will come in. That may not be the standard. Now, if they have the original case, they can make their own decisions according to law. But I don't think we should be overly optimistic about it.
But their Bill of Rights, for police is like, I've always said it. If you hired somebody to protect your home like a security guard. And then you come home and that security guard beat the shit out of you or killed you. That's what's happening. We're the taxpayers. People forget, we're the taxpayers. We're the ones that are paying them to protect us. What's wrong with that picture?
Well,
They don't
the
respect you, that's
picture's,
the problem.
the picture's
They don't
horrible.
respect you.
And the officers are not going to change until they're held completely accountable. Accountability doesn't mean that you violate a policy and procedure, so we're going to suspend you for 3 or 4 days. Real accountability is when I've looked at your record and you have an extensive amount of use of force cases that have been lodged against you, and you've been found guilty. Well, guess what? That's when you all, the taxpayers and everyone, should be saying, you make that officer go get their own insurance to cover them and the expenses that it's costing our city for negligence sometimes and for failure for them to be properly supervised. So that's where I'm at on this, and I know you say, she's a police officer, she's talking like that. I'm the president of a union that is not part of the POA, and this is what we stand for.
This is Officers for Justice that Captain Williams is talking about. I got one more quick question, and then I know that we might have some questions from the audience, and I want to give folks here an opportunity to ask some questions of the panelists. A lot of the discussion about reform usually ends up, at least from what I've heard, in, well, we need to better fund the police. We need to give more money to them. That's the problem. They don't have enough money. There's not enough officers. Even now, in the wake of the school shooting in Texas, in Uvalde, they're talking about, well, we need to put more police officers in the schools with guns. Captain Williams, you're smiling. You know I'm going to ask you about this. Is this the solution? Do we need more officers with more guns, especially in places like our schools, school resource officers?
You would put me in this difficult situation. I was the captain of the School Resource Officers Program here in San Francisco and the developer of the post-training for school resource officers throughout California. A school resource officer has to be highly trained, very skillful, and really have a desire to want to be in a school system. However, I found that school resource officers are just now usually the ones who are new to the department, or they may be someone who just is tired of working on the street, so they want to just take a little break, and they think, oh, I'll just hang out at school, kumbaya.
No,
That's not what it's supposed to be about. You're supposed to be at that school making relationships, developing relationships, not only with the students, but also with the teachers and the staff. So I think we cannot let our guns do the talking for us. We have to do it ourselves. And the baddest weapon that I carry is not my gun. And this is what I tell students when I go into their classroom. And don't get excited about the gun, because the baddest weapon that I have is my pen. Because when I write my report, I can take your freedom away from you for a long time. So don't worry about the gun, because that's nothing. You need to actually get to know me, because I don't sleep in a blue uniform at nighttime. I take off my clothes like everybody else does. I'm not Superwoman. I don't fly through buildings and all of these things. And I don't solve cases overnight. So in response to the question about police officers in schools with guns, how about police officers in school, after school, helping young people get their homework done? How about police officers sitting down with parents, helping them and encouraging them as to what we can do to establish some type of program for that young person? That's where I'm at on this.
All right, well, thank you for that. Look, I know that we're running a little bit short on time, and I want to give an opportunity for some questions from the audience. I see a hand up. You're going to have to speak up. I can't reach over there.
I guess
Yes. Yes, you're projecting well.
It's a lovely panel. I appreciate everyone that's up there. And I thought, I think Captain Williams really did tell the truth. Some of us watched the evil that befell her here in this city. It was horrific. I remember being at a police commission meeting over Mario Wood's killing. And the news had broke that the Police Officers Association had publicly sanctioned Captain Williams. It was horrific everywhere we went. And so I always wanted to thank her for being courageous enough to break up the tide and climb onto the steps of the Blue Ribbon panel and give testimony. It really changed things, and she's always been a hero of mine. I really
She's certainly a hero of mine and deserves those flowers, not at all. I know we have another question for folks.
It's over here.
Yes? Precious, before we get to you, yes?
I think I might have missed this, but what gives that case in the Portrero original jurisdiction?
Burst, Mr. Burst, you want to take that? So this is the case that we're just talking about. It's a new case where two guys were shot out
Gives
over
the
here.
DA, the Attorney General, original
Yes.
jurisdiction. The new state statute, new law that was passed by the legislature that says if there is a police shooting of an unarmed man, that case will be investigated initially by the Attorney General. And they take that out of the jurisdiction of the local police agency with San Francisco DAs or San Francisco Police. This is something that we've asked for a long, long time. We hope it will be successful. That's a function of whether or not the Attorney General office has very capable people there. Sometimes they don't have people who have experience dealing with police cases because they really haven't had to do it. But we hope that they will bring on people that have experience in evaluating police cases and make good decisions about
I
them.
appreciate that information. I teach legal and constitutional history at San Francisco State, and I think that's a step forward. Thank you so much.
Denise, did you have something that you wanted to add to that, or?
Yeah, I think John covered it well. I'm pretty sure it's AB 540, and it's basically a new bill that requires mandates unarmed, shootings of unarmed folks to be investigated by the AGs. Yeah.
So we see we have one other question here, and I don't mean to, I got my back to some folks over here. But we have one question, yes.
I thank you for being here. You have very tough work. We all have very tough work ahead. One of the few bright spots that I worked on, I believe, with the captain many years ago, and you can find a video that I made with our public defender, Jeff Adachi, on archive.org, where we had a panel against tasers. And if I'm correct, we don't permit officers to carry tasers. This is one of the few bright spots in otherwise a very sad history for all these. Now, how have we been able to keep tasers out of the hands of the San Francisco Police Department officers?
Great question. I don't know the answer to that.
I actually, I think I spoke at one of those hearings the San Francisco Police Commission was having. At the time, they were considering whether to employ tasers. And I think the consensus was that it was a, quote, a tool that they didn't really need. And that at the time, there was a lot of data out that people were dying and they were killed. And from tasers, it's a question how you use them, because they can be very abusive in inflicting a form of street justice. And so I think San Francisco at the time decided that the officers have enough equipment already. I mean, they do have non-lethal weapons, they have batons, they have the verbal skills, they have a lot. And they didn't really need an additional weapon, particularly one that there was evidence at the time that a higher percentage of people would die from it if it was misused. So that's really what
Are we
happened.
the only police department that doesn't allow tasers?
Well, I don't know if it's the
No.
only one. I know most have them, but really, and that's an issue we have to deal with all the time. And sometimes I've said, why didn't you use your taser instead of being shot and killing someone? We've done that because we found that if you're in a position to use a taser, you should use it as opposed to shooting that person. And so we've gone through that in different cities. It's the same kind of weapon, though, that you have to say, was it reasonable to use that particular weapon? Just because you have it, don't mean you get to use it. And so that's a fight that we have every case, I must admit.
And let me just add on that.
Go ahead,
If you
Roberto.
look at 50 years ago, and you look at what a police officer had on, and you look at today, it's a military. They're equipped. It's more and more you're having these individuals like they're the Marines wearing equipment. And if you look at the equipment that's being purchased by the police department across the country, they're buying, machine guns.
Yeah, old military gear,
Yeah.
essentially.
And I didn't have any more room on my utility belt to put another piece of equipment. And when they told me they were about to get something else, I said, I'm not carrying it. I don't have any more room. And it is true. If you have too many choices, that can also lead to the wrong decision when you're under pressure and stress.
And folks, if you don't believe me, look at the old episodes of Batman where Adam West left off every series asking, what is he going to do? What are the Cape Crusaders going to do with this utility belt that had far too many options? Listen, I think we're about out of time. I appreciate all of you. I want everybody to thank our panelists for being here. Roberto Hernandez, Denise Gastelum, John Burris, and Captain Yolanda Williams. My name is DeWitt Lacey of Good in Common. We hope that you'll check it out. We hope that it's a tool that will help and continue to educate folks on their individual rights. If you want to have words with any of the panelists, I believe we'll be here for a couple minutes. And then, people got to move because we're still fighting for justice, all right?
And the Warriors are playing. But before we go, can I ask Deborah to come up and take a picture of us? All right, thank you. It'll be nice. We got to document this.
Right on, okay.
Take
No
a,
doubt.
and Deborah, with your camera, Deborah.
Sorry.
Oh, you do? Well,
Oh, yeah.
Can you send them to us?
We got tons of pictures for you.